Did you know that with identical twins, when one has multiple sclerosis, the other usually doesn't have it? And even when they both do, there are often large differences in severity of the disease. What does this teach us about the pathogenesis of MS and important environmental factors in the disease? I'll show you research on the topic along with information about 4 of my own patients, 2 sets of identical twins with MS. But we'll start with these twins. These are not my patients. This is from a published article online. Donna Gordon and Tracy Dewitt. They look different just because of the hairstyles, but you can see the facial similarities. Donna had an onset of MS at age 20 with right arm and leg numbness. She improved and was stable for many years, but had a relapse at age 37 with numbness from the torso down and multiple sclerosis hug, a tightening around the thoracic area associated with thoracic spine lesions, and was diagnosed formally with MS at that time and has been stable since that time. Tracy was diagnosed 18 years later at age 38 after developing numbness in the right arm and leg after running a half marathon at Disney World. She then had a relapse in 2021 with vertigo and right-sided symptoms requiring a cane. She improved somewhat and started the drug Ocrevus, but has some ongoing symptoms. So you can see there are huge differences in these identical twins, one diagnosed 18 years later and with more significant symptoms. Identical twins don't have identical courses of MS. So let's look at some of the research on identical twins and MS. This study looked at 12 sets of monozygotic twins, monozygotic from one zygote, in other words, identical twins. 6 out of 12 were concordant, meaning they both had MS, and the other half, one had MS but the other did not, and there was a wide variation in the severity of the disease and the age of onset. Interestingly, the more recently diagnosed twin on average had lower levels of antibodies, immunoglobulin G and immunoglobulin M, in the cerebrospinal fluid, maybe suggesting there was less inflammation that caused a delay in the clinical onset of the symptoms possibly. Some twins that didn't have MS did have abnormalities in the cerebrospinal fluid like oligoklonal bands, suggesting that the underlying inflammatory phenotype may have been present, but somehow that twin was resistant to developing the clinical disease. This study found a lower risk of MS if your identical twin has it, only 25.3%, and it was higher for women, 34%, and much lower for men, only 6.5%. And that makes sense because men have a lower risk of MS overall, but only 3 out of 46 of men who have an identical twin with the same genome with the disease actually develop MS, and this is strong evidence that there are significant non-genetic environmental factors in developing the disease. This study from the British Isles corroborates that 25% figure, the risk of MS if your identical twin has it, compared to dizygotic or fraternal twins that have no special genetic relationship beyond just ordinary siblings but are just in the same womb, of only 3%, roughly the same risk of MS of siblings when one sibling is affected. However, if an identical twin did not have the disease, about 13% had abnormalities on MRI scans consistent with demyelinating lesions, suggesting they may have a subclinical form of the disease. This is a meta-analysis looking at 8 different twin studies, and they estimate the risk of MS is around 50% determined by genetics, 21% based on shared environmental factors. One thing about identical twins is they usually grow up in the same household and may have similar environmental factors as well, like exposure to Epstein-Barr virus, diet, cleanliness, and other things that could influence the risk. And they also say 29% unique environmental factors. I don't necessarily trust the methodology of this study, so take it with a grain of salt. By the way, my name is Brandon Beaber. I make videos about MS every Wednesday. Citations on this topic below. So let's move to studies that look at differences between the 2 identical twins. If their genes are the same and there's a different phenotype, there must be something else, something environmental that's driving this difference. So this study looked at 61 sets of identical twins that were discordant for MS. In other words, one has MS, the other does not. And they looked at characteristics of their immune cells. And they found a difference in the CD25 IL-2 axis. So IL-2 or interleukin-2 is a cytokine or cell signaling protein that's secreted by T cells, and it's known to be involved in the pathogenesis of MS. It causes the proliferation and activation of certain other immune cells, and it's part of the T helper cell type 1 pathway known to be related to MS. For instance, some MS drugs such as beta interferon cause a shift from the Th1 pathway to the Th2 pathway, changing the phenotype of immune cells. Now, CD25 is part of the interleukin-2 receptor. It's the alpha subunit of the receptor of interleukin-2, so it sort of receives IL-2 on the surface of other cells. And both of these things, CD25 and interleukin-2, are elevated in MS in the red compared to the twin without MS. Now, there's a lot of individual variation. In an individual person, it doesn't mean much, but the trend is clear. There's a statistically significant trend towards higher levels of IL-2 and higher levels of CD25 expression in the identical twin with MS. You can see the p-values of 0.0065 and 0.0085. Doesn't necessarily mean this causes multiple sclerosis. It could be reverse causation, that having MS causes enhancement of the IL-2 axis, but there's definitely a trend here. They also found elevation of VLA4 in people with MS compared to those without MS. VLA4 is on the surface of lymphocytes, B and T cells, that allows them to traffic into the central nervous system, and it's the target of the MS drug Tysabri. The trend is slight here, but it was statistically significant, p equals 0.03. Interestingly, they also found there's an association between a difference in the level of interleukin-2, what I mentioned earlier, the pro-inflammatory cytokine, between the two twins, the affected identical twin and the unaffected identical twin, and the level of disability. So on the x-axis here is EDSS, Expanded Disability Status Scale. It's a 0 to 10 scale. Higher means more disability. 0 is no disability. 6 means a cane is needed to walk 100 meters. 3 to 4 would be moderate disability. At 7.5, a wheelchair would be needed. And on the y-axis is the difference in interleukin-2 between the two twins, and you can see the regression analysis, there's an upwards association. It's as though if you have higher levels of IL-2, more inflammation relative to what it should be, in other words, what your identical twin without MS has, the greater your chance of having severe multiple sclerosis. This study looked at the lipids or fats in cell membranes of 73 sets of identical twins discordant for MS, again when one has MS and the other doesn't, and they were very similar, but there were slight differences, with the person with MS likely to have a reduction in ether phosphatidylcholines, ether phosphatidylethanolamines, and ordinary phosphatidylcholines. I'm not sure of the significance of this. Here is a study on epigenetics. So epigenetics are changes above the level of the genome, not simply the sequence of nucleotides, but things that change the expression of DNA. For example, when DNA is methylated, when methyl groups are added to DNA, it causes it to become tightly coiled so it is not transcribed into messenger RNA, which would normally be translated into protein. In other words, it silences the DNA so it's not as active. And they found that between the two identical twins, DNA methylation was highly similar. So even epigenetics is to some extent just genetic. However, there were slight differences. They found differences in 7 regions. One of them was the TMEM232 promoter, which is known to be involved in inflammation in atopic dermatitis, inflammation due to a foreign substance on the skin, and the promoter ZBTB16, which is involved in the development of T cells, so perhaps epigenetics plays a small factor. This study looks at the microbiome of 2 female identical twins, both with multiple sclerosis, both 32 years old. They're both doing well with low disability, one with an EDSS of 1 and the other with an EDSS of 0. But you can see there are significant differences in the oral microbiome. This is just from the mouth, not the full gastrointestinal tract. So just because people are genetically identical doesn't mean they have the same gastrointestinal flora, and this could change the development and severity of MS, though more research is needed on this topic. It's well known that Epstein-Barr virus, the cause of mono, is linked to MS, and this older study, published in 1990, did in fact show that with two identical discordant twins, the one with MS is more likely to have elevation in antibodies against EBV, suggesting prior infection, than the unaffected twin without MS. And it's interesting to look at the twin-twin correspondence of different conditions. So in MS, the twin-twin correspondence, the probability of having MS if your identical twin has the disease, is around 25%, the average of various studies. This is what it is in different diseases. Some diseases it's very high, asthma 94.3%, autism 92%. These diseases are thought to be significantly genetic. And MS is kind of along the lines with other autoimmune diseases. Rheumatoid arthritis 15.4%, lupus 24%. So if one thing can be taken from this presentation, MS isn't a genetic disease. Certainly there is some genetic predisposition, but there's a strong environmental or even random component to it. And many things in life aren't genetic at all. For instance, handedness, like hand preference, the hand you write with, isn't really strongly genetic. This looks at hand preference of pairs of monozygotic or identical twins, fraternal or dizygotic twins, or just regular siblings. And you can see that identical twins were actually more likely to have opposite handedness, 20.7%, versus typical siblings, 13.2%. So I'll end by telling you about my 4 patients, the 2 sets of identical twins. Now, all 4 of these individuals have MS, and I'm going to be super vague here. Obviously, it's rare for people to be identical twins. I don't want to say anything that could be identifying. For the first set of twins, their course of MS is almost identical. They're presenting symptoms. Even their MRI findings are very, very similar. It's just uncanny. They really are exactly the same in their course of MS, and they develop the disease at about the same time. One strange thing about this set of twins is they actually scheduled the appointment together. So 2 appointments, but they came to the room at the same time. And I looked at them and I said, "You are identical twins." And they said, "No, we're fraternal twins." And I looked very closely at them and I said, "You look exactly the same. I'm fairly certain you're identical twins." And they were apparently told from a young age that their mother knew they were fraternal and not identical, even during their obstetric ultrasound. And so what the obstetrician saw is that there were 2 sacs, like this on the left. There were 2 separate eggs. And you can see there's an amniotic fluid around each individual fetus, and then a chorion that surrounds both fetuses in identical twins. But actually, sometimes with identical twins, there's actually a separation, and you get 2 separate chorions. And so they were erroneously informed that they could not be identical twins. You definitely can. In rare cases, the amnion is shared, and that can actually be dangerous and lead to some obstetric complications. So they lived a significant part of their life not even knowing they were identical twins. Now, for the other set of identical twins, I'll just say that there's absolutely nothing similar about their course of multiple sclerosis, their symptoms, their MRI findings. One has very mild symptoms and the other has quite significant disability. There's a very large difference in disability and severity of the disease between the 2 identical twins, so it's definitely possible for identical twins to have a different prognosis of MS. So obviously a lot of the research I presented is very preliminary and speculative, but I think one thing is clear: MS is not purely a genetic disease, and there's a strong environmental component, and there may be a lot we can do to alter the prognosis of the disease in an individual with MS. Now, it's unlikely I'm talking to identical twins here, but a lot of people watching this may have family members with MS. It's previously been reported that although there seems to be genetic risk in developing MS, there isn't really a strong familial association in the severity of the disease. In other words, it's common for one person to be mildly affected and for another to be more severely affected. If you have family members with MS, comment, how is their disease different from yours? And do you think there could be differences in lifestyle or environmental factors that could be contributing to the difference in prognosis? And let me know if you have ideas for future videos.